Is that supposed to be patriotic or just pathetic? The insult cut through the quiet like a dull blade, landing harder than the voice expected. Still, a few chuckles broke the surface, uneasy, but real. At the center of the room, an elderly man stood at the podium. Tall, thin, with shoulders set back in something that looked like pride, but felt like armor. His shirt collar hung open, and from just beneath it, pale, stretched skin peeked upward, twisted in long, uneven lines that ran along his jaw and disappeared beneath the fabric. Burn scars, old ones, the kind that don't fade, not on skin or memory. His arms, too, bore the marks, exposed beneath sleeves carefully rolled to the forearm. He hadn't tried to hide them. A younger man near the council seat smirked. "I mean, come on. You walk in here looking like a campfire marshmallow and expect us to take you seriously." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. No one laughed this time. No one spoke. No one stood. The old man didn't react, didn't flinch. His hands rested lightly on a black cane, fingers calm, the scars winding across his knuckles like something earned, not survived. The mayor looked down. The council shuffled papers. A few eyes turned toward the back rows. There, someone sat forward slightly in their chair. A teenage hand tightened around a folded piece of paper, and then the old man blinked, slow and deliberate, and stepped away from the mic. He never said a word, but someone else would. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The chamber wasn't large, but it had the kind of space that made sound travel too well. The echo of shoes on polished tile, the scrape of chair legs, the low hum of old ventilation units pushing recycled air through tired vents. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed faintly overhead, flickering once before settling into their usual quiet flicker. It was Thursday evening, the third one of the month, as always. At the front, the podium stood centered under the town seal, a carved wooden crest of Glenmere Township, flanked by two flags, one the American standard, slightly faded, and the other, the town's own, navy blue and cream, forgotten by most except the clerk who raised it before each meeting. To the right sat the council, 5 figures in pressed shirts and nameplates, backlit by rows of dusty plaques and framed certificates no one had truly read in years. And walking toward them, with a gait both steady and slow, was Harold Baines. 84 winters had carved into him. Not just time, but heat, fire, loss. He was dressed plainly, as always. A crisp button-up shirt tucked into faded slacks, sleeves rolled with the same exact fold at each elbow. A worn cane tapped softly with every third step, his left leg bearing the brunt of his weight. The scars across his arms didn't glisten anymore. They had aged into something almost quiet, pale rivers of ruin curled in the lines of motion. His collar was open not carelessly, but by choice. He didn't conceal what life had branded onto him. He moved like a man used to calculating each shift in weight, not with fragility, but with discipline, like someone who had at one point been taught how to move under pressure. Harold didn't speak often at these meetings. In fact, he rarely approached the microphone. But he came every time, third Thursday, 7 o'clock, and sat in the second row near the aisle, always upright, always present. People assumed he just liked routine. They didn't know he was still watching, still guarding, still remembering. Tonight, though, there was more than memory pressing against the walls. On the agenda, a public vote to reclaim space from dated fixtures, a modernizing proposal that, among other things, included the removal of the war memorial display in the building's west wing, a black stone slab inscribed with the names of Glenmere's lost, a flag in a case, a folded letter from a boy who never came home. Harold had stood by that display for years, quietly, as if counting names. Now they wanted to replace it with a digital information kiosk. Behind Harold in the third row, Eli Baines sat rigid, 17, tall for his age, dark-haired, and stone still. His hands were on his knees, fingers curled slightly, knuckles pale. He didn't shift. He didn't check his phone. His eyes didn't leave his grandfather's back. The same back he'd seen through open doorways at night, shirt half off, the deep scars curling over shoulder blades like burned wings. He never asked. Not then. Harold reached the podium. The microphone squealed slightly as he adjusted it, his fingers steady, slow, deliberate. As he moved, the rolled cuff of his left sleeve slid an inch upward, revealing more of the old injury. Skin that had once blistered now lay flattened in a permanent state of healing. It was the kind of damage most people never saw outside of combat documentaries or burn units. And even then, never on someone standing upright with that kind of dignity. He didn't speak right away. He didn't look at the council. He only cleared his throat softly and leaned a fraction forward. A quiet respect filled the silence, the kind that follows men who have faced things they don't speak of. Then a voice from the right side of the chamber broke the air. "I've seen better special effects in a Halloween aisle." Another chuckle, this one louder. Eli's jaw flexed, his teeth pressed together until his temples pulsed. Harold didn't react, not even a blink. He placed both hands on the edge of the podium, the pads of his fingers brushing the grain of the wood like an old ritual. One breath in, one breath out. He hadn't come to fight, but he had come to stand. Behind the council table, the mayor kept her eyes down. One of the other members shuffled a few papers, avoiding the tension like it was a cold draft. No reprimands, no objections. Just a thin silence now curling through the room like dust under a closed door. Eli's foot tapped once against the tile, once, then stilled again. Harold turned his head just slightly, enough to hear the soft creak of the next speaker rising from the chairs along the wall. He gave a small nod, stepped away from the mic, and walked slowly back toward the aisle. He never looked at his grandson, but Eli never looked away. As Harold passed his row, Eli's fingers released from their grip, leaving faint impressions on his palms. The room continued with its schedule, but something had shifted. Not in the council, not yet. Inside him. The next insult wouldn't land the same way. The next speaker was a man in his 40s, a local contractor who fumbled his way through a short pitch about zoning codes and parking space limitations. No one really listened, not because it wasn't important, but because the temperature in the room had changed. The kind of change that doesn't show up in degrees, but in the silence that follows words never meant to be said out loud. Harold sat again in his usual seat, second row, end of the aisle. His movements were minimal, each one economical. He rested his cane across his lap, folding both hands over it. The fingers, slightly warped at the joints, bore old burn patterns that curved inward like calligraphy. He held them together loosely, not clenched, not stiff, but as a man who had long since stopped being startled by pain. His gaze stayed ahead, not on the speaker, but somewhere slightly above him, perhaps on the town seal, or the faded flag beyond it, or a memory pinned in the space where no one else could see. Behind him, Eli leaned forward just a bit. His elbows rested on his knees now, his hands clasped, fingers laced tight. He hadn't moved much since his grandfather had returned to his seat, but something about him had changed. It was in the way his breath slowed, long inhales held too long before release, and in the unblinking focus of his stare. A new speaker took the floor. A woman in a gray cardigan, polite and cheerful, spoke about plans to digitize archival records. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed, professional. She never once looked toward the Veterans Memorial that her proposal would erase. Harold listened. His head tilted slightly, but his posture remained unchanged. He gave no outward sign of offense. If anything, his stillness grew even sharper, not defensive, but disciplined, like a man sitting through a briefing he'd heard before and already accepted. One of the council members whispered something to the one beside him. A small laugh was shared between them, quickly stifled. Eli's jaw tensed again. Harold's fingers tapped once on the cane. Just once, barely audible. The cardigan woman concluded her presentation. The mayor nodded without comment. The room shuffled again. Chairs creaked. The air smelled faintly of floor wax and old air conditioning, the sterile scent of places that never changed, even as the people in them did. The next name was called. A man in a slim blue suit, younger than the others, approached the podium with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to pushback. His badge read, Deputy Councilman Darren Marks. His tie was too tight, knotted high on his throat, the silk catching the overhead lights as he adjusted the microphone. "We need to stop pretending that everything old is sacred just because it's old," he began, smiling faintly. "Some things belong in museums, not City Hall." And a few heads nodded. Not many, not all. "Let's not kid ourselves. That memorial over there? It doesn't mean anything to most of the people who walk by it every day. It's just a wall, black stone, cold metal. No one under 30 even knows what half those names mean." Eli's breath hitched, quiet but sudden. "And frankly," Marks continued, gesturing casually toward the west wall where the memorial plaque sat, "keeping that thing around is like holding onto a scar and calling it a trophy." The word struck. Scar. Harold didn't move, but his eyes blinked, once, slower than usual. "And speaking of which," Marks chuckled lightly, "I know we're all supposed to pretend we didn't notice, but if you're gonna come up here and make a statement, maybe wear long sleeves." Silence followed. Not total, not the kind earned by awe, but a vacuum, a pressure drop, the absence of reaction. Even those who had laughed earlier seemed to brace now, not in protest, but in shame. Harold turned his head, just slightly, not toward Marks, but toward the wall with the plaque. Then he returned his gaze forward. He did not defend himself. He did not rise. He did not leave. He simply remained, a stone among shadows. Eli stood, not fast, not loud, but with a slowness that felt heavier than anything that had been said all evening. His chair creaked softly as it slid back against the tile. A few heads turned. A woman in the fourth row glanced up, her eyes narrowing. Marks paused. The smirk faltered. Eli didn't speak. Not yet. He just stood and waited. Marks swallowed, suddenly aware of the stillness. He shuffled his papers, coughed once and said, "Anyway, that concludes my remarks." He stepped down. Harold didn't turn, but his hand gripped the cane a little tighter now. Eli remained standing. Then slowly, he sat again, not because he changed his mind, but because he was waiting for the right time. The room returned to order, but something inside Eli did not. It had heard enough, and it would speak, soon. A light rain had started to tap against the old courthouse windows by the time the next speaker took the floor. Gentle at first, then steadier, as if the sky itself had grown uncomfortable with what it had just heard. Inside, the room sat under a quiet that wasn't peace. It was a heavy stillness, the kind that settles on a place when dignity has been ignored and no one is willing to name it yet. Harold remained unmoved in his seat, his hand still folded across the curve of the cane in his lap, his back unbent. His head held just high enough to suggest this posture wasn't pride. It was discipline, ritual, instinct. This was a man who had once been trained to hold still even when everything around him burned. Not because it didn't hurt, but because stillness under fire was how men lived. Eli didn't lean back in his seat. He sat forward now, forearms resting on his knees, hands clasped tight. The muscles in his jaw ached from how long he'd been clenching his teeth. He couldn't stop replaying the sound of the insult, not just the words, but the silence that followed, the smirks, the absence of outrage. He looked around the room, eyes passing over each council member. Most of them hadn't looked up since Marks made his remarks. One of them was pretending to type something on a tablet, though nothing blinked on the screen. Another was doodling in the margins of a printed agenda sheet. That one had laughed earlier. Eli remembered. Across the aisle, an older woman in a denim jacket glanced Harold's way, her mouth pressed into a thin, uncertain line. She didn't speak. No one did. The memorial sat just a few feet from her chair, the stone plaque cold and quiet, like it had always been. It bore 31 names. Eli had counted them once as a kid, trying to imagine what it must have meant to grow up with that many ghosts in your town. He'd asked his grandfather who the names belonged to. Harold hadn't answered right away. He'd only said, "People I knew, some for a day, some for a year, all of them longer than I should have." Eli's eyes dropped to the floor, then to Harold's left hand, still gently resting across the cane. The skin there, scarred and sun-spotted, told more stories than Harold ever had aloud. The burns curled around his knuckles like faded rope. He remembered once, when he was small, reaching for that hand during a 4th of July parade. He'd flinched when he felt the roughness, not from fear, but surprise. He remembered looking up. Harold had looked down. Their eyes had met for a brief second. No words were exchanged. But from then on, Eli had never pulled away again. At the front of the room, the mayor called for a short recess. She didn't acknowledge what had happened, didn't name the insult or offer a correction. She simply stated that the council would reconvene in 10 minutes and left the dais. Councilman Marks followed her out, chatting with another aide, his tone casual, untouched by consequence. The room broke into low murmurs and scattered movement. Some people stood, some checked their phones. A woman offered someone a peppermint from a paper purse. The storm outside ticked harder now against the glass, as if reminding them it hadn't forgotten. Harold remained seated. He hadn't moved since returning from the podium, not even to sip the small paper cup of water he'd been handed. It sat untouched on the floor beside his chair, condensation forming a faint ring on the tile. He stared ahead, not out of stubbornness or disapproval, but with the same kind of fixed gaze a man develops after years of looking at something most people won't. Pain, fire, silence. None of it had ever chased him off, so he didn't look away now. Eli stood again, not abruptly, not in protest. He rose with quiet intention, stretching his legs and stepping once toward the edge of the aisle. He didn't walk to the front, not yet. He just stood there, looking at the council table now empty, the microphone now silent. Something in him was shifting. It wasn't a matter of anger. It was weight, legacy, and the mounting burden of knowing you're the only one in the room who still feels the heat from a fire, long since burned out. A man near the back glanced up and nodded toward Eli but said nothing. A veteran, judging by the pin on his lapel. He looked to be in his 60s, one of those who had remained still during the insult, unsure whether to speak or wait. Eli noticed him, but didn't nod back. His eyes returned to Harold, who now blinked slowly, as if he were trying to hold on to a memory just below the surface. Years ago, Eli had found an old letter in a drawer in Harold's garage. It was partially burned, the edges crisped and black, the ink still legible in the center. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a name, Private Collins, and a date. Below that, a few short lines. "I got you out. I couldn't get him. I hope you made it." "I never did." Eli had asked about it once. Harold had said it was just a draft. That was all. Then he changed the subject. The letter hadn't been mentioned again. Eli still had it. A council aide returned and began adjusting a stack of folders at the dais. The mayor followed, expression unreadable. Marks trailed behind, eyes flicking briefly toward Harold before returning to his tablet screen. He said nothing. The recess was over. Chairs creaked as people began settling again. The mayor tapped the mic and thanked everyone for their patience. Her voice was smooth, distant, too practiced. Eli remained standing for a moment longer, then sat again, slower this time. A hand brushed his back as someone passed by, but he didn't turn to see who. The mayor cleared her throat. "The floor is open again for comments from the public." Harold didn't rise, but something in the air did. It was invisible, but gathering, and it would not leave quietly. No one moved right away. The mayor's voice had given the floor back to the public, but there were no volunteers. Not yet. There was a pause, a long one, where the only sound was the soft rustle of paper being folded at the edge of the dais and the distant metallic clink of someone refilling a water cup near the back. A small air conditioning vent rattled once above the window before returning to its faint, breath-like hum. The sound of the storm outside had faded now, turned to a low hiss that blurred the edges of the glass with soft rain. Harold sat still, as if carved from time itself. He had not responded to the insult, had not acknowledged it. His face remained unreadable, but not because it lacked feeling. It was the face of someone who had learned long ago that speaking didn't always make the pain smaller. Sometimes it only made the silence afterward heavier. His eyes fixed again on the front of the room, somewhere beyond the podium, beyond the flags, maybe not even in this room at all. Eli was no longer breathing evenly. His chest rose and fell in a slow, stifled rhythm, like someone standing waist-deep in cold water, resisting the instinct to shiver. His hands, still folded loosely between his knees, bore the pale outlines of his fingernails from when they had pressed into his palms earlier. The paper he had tucked into his back pocket, still folded from days ago, was beginning to crease under pressure. He hadn't planned to read it. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. It wasn't a speech. It was a memory. The mayor's voice sounded again. If anyone else wishes to comment on the proposed renovations or memorial restructuring, now is the time. Still, no one moved. Eli looked around slowly, not dramatically, just enough to see. A woman 2 rows across stared into her lap. A man near the side wall, in a veterans organization cap, shifted his weight uncomfortably but did not rise. No one else even looked up. He turned forward again, looked once more at Harold, then at the microphone. His stomach clenched, not from fear, from knowing it had to be him. He stood, no preamble, no announcement, just the quiet scrape of a chair leg, deliberate and steady. The sound of him rising carried across the small room like a clock chiming out of rhythm. Eyes turned. A few murmurs began. One of the council aides glanced toward the mayor, but she didn't stop him. Eli stepped into the aisle, the old courthouse tiles smooth under his sneakers, his shadow long in the overhead light. He moved slowly, as if each step had to be weighed before taken. The distance between his seat and the microphone felt longer than it had before. Not in feet, but in what waited at the end of it. The truth, the heat, the choice to no longer sit still. He reached the podium and stopped. There was no name card for him, no sign-up sheet entry. The microphone stood too high. He didn't lower it. His hands didn't touch the podium. He didn't look at the council. He looked out, past them, into the room, not at individuals, but through the silence they left behind. And he spoke. He doesn't need to defend himself, but I can't stay quiet while you mock what he lived through. The room stilled again. No coughs, no shifting, just the words hanging there like smoke in still air. Eli's voice wasn't raised. It didn't shake, but there was weight behind it. Something raw, something unpolished and untrained. Not a performance, but a break. A crack in the wall that had been holding everything back. You saw the scars, you saw the damage. That's all you looked at. And you decided it was funny, or pitiful, or something to ignore. He let that sit. Harold didn't move, but his cane tapped once, softly, against the floor. Not dropped, placed, like punctuation. Eli continued. But I see something else. I see a man who ran into fire, not away from it, who burned for it, who still hears the ones he couldn't save. A faint shift in the crowd. The woman in the denim jacket lowered her head. I see a man who came back when it would have been easier not to, who built things with hands that can barely feel, who fixed cars, raised kids, coached Little League, and never once, not once, talked about the day he stopped being whole. He breathed in and exhaled slow. And now he's supposed to feel shame, because he doesn't wear a suit to hide what war left behind, because he doesn't need to dress his scars in silence for your comfort. A murmur from the side. Someone cleared their throat, not in protest, in guilt. You talk about history like it's just granite and names. You want a kiosk to replace a stone wall, something with cleaner lines, maybe a touch screen. You want progress. But what are you progressing from? From memory? From sacrifice? From the very people who gave you the peace to sit here in comfort while mocking the ones who paid for it? The words landed heavy. Even the air felt different, denser, charged. Eli stepped slightly forward, not to intimidate, but to fill the space where truth had been missing. You want to forget. You want to erase. Because remembering makes you uncomfortable. His voice grew quieter, but not weaker. He lives with those memories every day. He wears them. You only had to see them for 5 minutes, and that was too much. He stopped, not because he was done, but because anything more would have been too soon. Behind him, Harold raised his chin just slightly. His eyes didn't shine, but they saw, and they understood. In that silence, Eli remained standing, waiting, not for applause, not for approval, only for the truth to settle. And it did. The silence that followed Eli's words wasn't empty. It was full of the things no one had said, full of the breath people had held too long, full of the weight of history that now pressed against the chest of everyone in the room. The young man still stood behind the podium, eyes steady, not looking for a reaction, not asking for anything. His voice had dropped away, but the echo of it remained, not in the microphone but in the atmosphere, in the posture of those who had shifted in their seats and now didn't know where to look. Eli's hands remained at his sides. He didn't lean on the podium. He didn't fidget. There was no grand performance in him, just the kind of stillness that follows truth when it's finally been spoken aloud. A woman in the front row slowly uncrossed her arms. The veteran in the back, the one with the lapel pin, looked down at his boots, then back up again. His eyes didn't leave Harold. Not this time. The mayor's mouth was pressed into a tight line. She looked at the councilman to her right, then back to Eli, then down at the agenda papers in front of her. They no longer held the same weight, not after what had just been laid bare in front of them all. Across the chamber, Councilman Marks sat with his arms folded. He was still, but his eyes weren't. They darted, flicking between Eli and Harold, then back again. For the first time that night, the smugness had faded from his face. What remained was harder to name. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, but something restless, unsettled. A recognition that he had pushed too far and now stood exposed. Eli stepped back from the microphone. He didn't turn and walk away yet. He stood there another moment, looking at no one and everyone at once. Then, slowly, he took the folded paper from his pocket, not to read it, but to hold it in his hand. It was nothing more than a scrap now, soft around the edges from being carried too long. He held it tightly, as if to remind himself of what he had spoken for. Harold hadn't moved. His posture had not changed, but there was something in his face now. Something still and deep, like a calm settling over a once violent sea. He looked not at Eli, but just past him, at the space where the microphone stood, as if the air still carried his grandson's voice. His fingers brushed the edge of his cane, not in tension, but in grounding, the touch of wood to skin like an anchor in a room that had suddenly shifted its weight. Then, in the quiet, someone stood. It was the woman in the denim jacket. She rose slowly, placing her purse on her chair, before folding her hands in front of her. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She looked at Harold, then at Eli, then back again, and nodded once. The kind of nod that doesn't demand attention, but gives it. Behind her, another figure stood, the veteran with the pin. He removed his cap, held it to his chest. The motion was fluid, reverent, familiar. His lips moved around a name only he could hear. The room had not erupted. There was no applause, no outburst. But a current had begun, silent and slow, like an old flag catching a rising wind. Councilwoman Devers, the youngest of the five, shifted in her seat. Her eyes were wet, but her expression was firm. She looked at Marks. He didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he looked at the table in front of him, as if hoping to find a door in the wood grain. None appeared. The mayor cleared her throat. Once, then again. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, edged with something that wasn't quite apology. "For your words." Eli nodded once, not with pride, not with relief, just acknowledgement. He stepped away from the podium and returned to his seat. As he passed Harold, he didn't speak. He simply paused beside him, placing the folded paper gently onto the cane across his lap. Then he sat, hands still, breath even, heart still loud in his chest. The mayor looked down again at her notes. Then she looked up. Her eyes moved past the council, past the flags, to the wall that housed the memorial. "Before we move forward," she said, "I think we need to take a moment." Her voice was steadier now. "To remember why this room exists in the first place." And for the first time that night, everyone looked at the stone, not out of habit, not out of obligation, but because now they could finally see it. The room had changed. It hadn't grown louder. It hadn't broken into applause. But the space between people had shifted. A subtle gravity had pulled them toward something larger than themselves. For so long, the scars had been the only visible evidence of what Harold Baines had carried. But now, every breath in the chamber seemed to wrap around those scars differently, not as curiosities or discomforts, but as declarations. The mayor remained standing, her gaze resting on the far wall where the black memorial plaque hung in quiet defiance. It had always been there. Generations had passed it. Coffee cups had been set beneath it. Children had run by it without asking what it was. Tonight, it finally had a voice. She stepped away from the dais, not with fanfare, but purpose, walking slowly to the edge of the room. Her heels clicked softly against the tile, the only sound aside from the rain, now whispering gently at the windows. She stopped a few feet from the wall and turned to face the room. "Sometimes," she said, "we forget the difference between what's old and what's earned." Her voice was quieter now, not for lack of strength, for reverence. She looked toward Harold, her eyes softer than they had been all night. "And sometimes we think that if we don't name something, we don't have to feel it." The council was still. Even Marks said nothing. His hands remained folded in front of him, his face caught between self-preservation and something quieter, something harder. Regret, perhaps, or shame too fresh to wear. "I've served on this council for 8 years, the mayor continued, and I've never heard anything like what we heard tonight. Not just from a young man speaking for his grandfather, but from someone who reminded all of us what silence can cost." She gestured toward the memorial. "That wall doesn't just hold names. It holds people. People who were here, people who aren't, and people who lived through the fire and came back carrying it." Her voice didn't break, but it deepened. "We owe you more than a moment, Mr. Baines. We owe you permanence." Harold didn't nod. He didn't move, but his eyes lifted fully now, locking with hers, holding steady. A new voice rose from the council table. It was Councilwoman Devers. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "I'd like to propose we not only preserve the memorial as it is, but add to it." She looked to Harold now. "There's room for more than names." A murmur swept through the crowd. This time, it wasn't resistance. It was something softer, agreement before words. The kind of assent that comes not from logic, but from conscience. Harold blinked. Once, then again. The mayor returned to the dais and looked to the others. "All in favor?" Hands lifted, one after another. Every one of them, even Marks. The vote was unanimous. The chamber didn't erupt. There were no claps, no shouts, no camera flashes. What followed was quieter, more sacred. The room stood, not all at once, but slowly, respectfully. People rose not because they were told, but because they felt they had to. A man who had remained seated all night now stood, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair in front of him. A woman near the wall pressed a tissue to her cheek and nodded to herself. The veteran in the back replaced his cap, hand trembling slightly as he adjusted the brim. Eli remained seated. He didn't need to rise. Not yet. His eyes were locked on Harold, who had not changed position. But in the lines of his face, something had shifted. The rigid stillness had softened. His shoulders, once squared with the weight of old command, had lowered, just a little, as if something invisible had been released. Then, slowly, Harold reached for the folded paper still resting on his cane. He didn't open it. He didn't read it. He just held it. His thumb brushed the edge, the movement delicate, not a habit, but a memory. A moment passed, then another, and then, as if some small thread of time had finally finished its loop, Harold rose. No one told him to. No one helped him. He stood of his own will, with his cane in one hand and the folded page in the other, his body upright with the quiet strength of someone who knew this wasn't for show. It was for the men he had known, the ones whose names were carved into stone and whose final words he still remembered. The room did not move. They watched. And for the first time in a long time, Harold walked, slowly, steadily, toward the memorial wall. He stopped just short of it, close enough that the lettering caught the reflection of his shirt collar. The scars were fully visible now, down his neck, across his hands, unmoving. He bowed his head. No one needed to hear what he whispered, because tonight, the town had finally listened. 1 week later, the sky over Glenmere was a softer gray. The storm had passed, leaving behind the faint scent of wet pavement and cooling earth. The courthouse windows were open for the first time in months, and the usual clatter of traffic outside was muted beneath the occasional bird song and the rustle of trees shaking free the last droplets of rain. The town hadn't changed much, but inside the council chamber, something had. The memorial wall now bore a new line. Beneath the names carved in black granite, names of the fallen, the missing, the too young, there was now another inscription, freshly cut, the stone still bearing traces of dust where the letters had been etched. Harold Baines, courage in silence, strength in fire. The lettering was simple, no plaque, no fanfare, just words that matched the man who had earned them. The room was quiet when Harold entered. He wore the same shirt, the same jacket, same rolled sleeves, the scars still visible beneath the fabric. He did not try to hide them. He never had. But today, the way people looked at him had changed. There were no side glances, no turned heads, only open eyes and nods, and the occasional hand to a chest, or a polite step aside to give him space he didn't ask for, but was finally offered. Eli walked beside him, matching his grandfather's pace without making it obvious. He didn't guide him. He didn't hover. He simply walked with him, as if they were going to the hardware store, or out for coffee, or just taking the long way home on a Sunday afternoon. No ceremony, just presence. They reached the second row, the familiar seat near the aisle, and stopped. It had a small velvet cushion now, freshly added, and a narrow wooden plaque affixed to the backrest. It read only 2 words, reserved honor. Harold didn't comment on it. He just nodded once and took his seat. Eli sat beside him, arms folded, legs stretched out in front of him slightly, the way teenagers do when they're not trying to look respectful, but are anyway. A few minutes later, the meeting began. The mayor welcomed everyone. She mentioned community updates, local grant deadlines, and new budget proposals. But her voice carried differently now. Not louder, not softer, but clearer, as if it too had shed some layer of insulation the previous week. Then, just before public comments began, Councilman Marks stood. He hadn't spoken since the last meeting. His name hadn't been on the list. He held a small envelope in his hand. Walking slowly to the front, he cleared his throat and addressed the mayor first, then turned to face the room. "I have something I'd like to submit to the record," he said. "It's not legislation. It's acknowledgement." He walked toward Harold, who remained seated. Without a word, Marks extended the envelope. Harold looked up, eyes steady, unreadable, then took it. Marks did not speak again. He didn't offer excuses, didn't fumble for grace. He nodded, a sharp, stiff movement, and returned to his seat. Eli leaned slightly, just enough to whisper, "You don't have to read it now." Harold didn't answer. He slipped the envelope into his inside jacket pocket. Then he exhaled, not heavily, not dramatically, but with the soft weight of something settling back into place. The meeting continued, but no one forgot the silence, and no one dared fill it too quickly. Later, after the room had emptied, Harold remained seated. Eli stood near the memorial wall, tracing the new inscription with his eyes. His grandfather didn't follow him, but watched from his chair, his cane resting across his knees. A young girl entered the room with her father, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and paused at the wall. She pointed up at the names, then at Harold's inscription. "Did he fight in a war?" she asked aloud. Her father nodded. "He did." The girl looked back at Harold and smiled, small and quiet. Then she saluted. Harold's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something close, something better, the kind of expression that speaks not of pride, but of peace. And for the first time in decades, the fire inside him, the one that had burned without smoke, without heat, without witness, softened, not extinguished, but seen. And that made all the difference. The courthouse sat quieter now. The chairs had been restacked, the lights dimmed by half. Outside, the sidewalks glistened with fading rain, and the world moved on in its usual unbothered rhythm. Dogs barking from porches, tires hissing over damp asphalt, the low hum of distant lawnmowers reclaiming the late summer afternoon. Inside, though, the air still carried something older, something heavier, something sacred. Harold was the last to rise. He did so slowly, carefully, the way men do when they know what their body can and cannot offer. The cane met the floor with a soft tap, and he steadied himself with one hand on the back of the chair that now bore his name. He didn't linger. He didn't speak. He simply turned toward the exit and began walking, not with urgency, but with the deliberate grace of a man who knew what it meant to leave on his own terms. Eli held the door for him. He didn't reach for Harold's arm. He didn't rush ahead. He just stood there, one hand on the glass, letting the weight of the past pass through before stepping outside himself. They walked in silence. The town square beyond the courthouse still held puddles from the storm. The flagpole stood straight in the breeze, its halyard line clinking lightly against the metal. A few leaves skittered across the brick path, and a distant church bell rang the half-hour. They reached the edge of the sidewalk before Harold finally spoke. "They didn't used to call it trauma," he said, eyes forward. "Back then, they just told you to wash up and get on with it." Eli didn't answer right away. He looked over at his grandfather. Not the scars, not the cane, not the burn-warped fingers. Just the man. "I think," Eli said carefully, "you gave them something they didn't know they needed." Harold paused. "Didn't give it to them," he replied. "Just stopped carrying it alone." They kept walking. Past the diner where Harold used to drink black coffee after the meetings. Past the barber shop where his photo still hung from a dusty frame. Past the war memorial at the park where the new flowers had not yet wilted. At the corner, they stopped. The light changed. Eli looked down at his shoes, then over at his grandfather again. "I'm glad I spoke," he said. "I know," Harold replied. And then, after a moment, he turned to him fully. "But I want you to understand something." Eli nodded. Harold held his gaze. "You didn't speak for me. You spoke beside me." Eli swallowed. There was nothing more to add. They crossed the street in silence, side by side. Not as a boy defending an elder, but as two men, one young, one old, both finally seen. And when they disappeared around the corner, the courthouse door swung gently shut behind them. But what they left behind did not close with it. It stayed, in the wood of the bench, in the wall of names, in the voice that finally rose where silence used to be, in a town that would never again mistake scars for shame. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.